Very special thanks once again to Affordable Prestige Cars. Of course, they're always a pleasure to work with, as you've seen before here on the channel, and if you want to check out their current stock, which includes cars like the one in this video, then of course click the link down in the video description, and they tend to change their inventory fairly often, so chances are if you're looking for something Jaguar or otherwise prestige related, they'll probably have it in at some point. As any of you who have been following my recent Jaguar reviews in particular will have seen, this is the third major XK review that I've done. In fact, I've also reviewed the XK, the standard 300 horsepower trim from this same generation, and of course, crucially to this review, in fact, the final XKR, the 2014 5-litre model, which shares its engine with the XFR, which incidentally I also reviewed, as well as the V6 engine F-Type. So it's a nice little pool of Jaguars that I'm currently working with, and doubtless there will be more added in future. One of the primary reasons why I wanted to do this particular XKR though, which is the mid-2000s to slightly later 2000s generation of course, is because I wanted to see how it compared to my favourite XK, which is the around 2007 standard model with 300 horsepower, but also, as I said, to see what kind of improvements there were and what kind of personality changes there might be, especially in terms of value for money, between this generation and that final 2014 car with a much larger engine, way more power, and technically superior performance as well, a slightly restyled interior, etc. So, to cut to the chase, I'm going to give you my overall thoughts first, and my verdict, my overarching verdict that is, on the XKR of this generation, and then we're going to talk some technical specs and see how it actually compares, not just for performance, because chances are if you're in the market you probably know a lot of that stuff anyway, but also the practicality side of things. How does it compare to the higher model and the lower one? So first of all, my verdict on this car is I love it. I absolutely love the XK overall of this generation in particular, the X150, and it compares extremely well to the other two. Now, interestingly, I actually like this car more than the final one, more than that 5-litre model. And the reason why is actually fairly simple. This car to me is more visceral. It feels more like an XKR would or should. It's basically what I expect an XKR to feel like. To me, as I kind of alluded to in my review of the 5-litre model, as great as that car is, and it is superior in many ways, it just surprised me by how sedate it felt most of the time. And although, yes, it's a GT, so being sedate for long distance journeys is kind of a good thing, for me, from an R model, I kind of expect a little bit more of a playful attitude from it. And that really surprised me as well in comparison between that car and the XFR, with which it shares its engine, because that is a very playful, extremely fun car, and is still my favourite Jag that I've reviewed so far on the channel. I believe that if you're going for an XKR, you should strongly consider this generation. Now, of course, this is not technically the fastest one out there. If you go a couple of years down the line or are willing to pay a little bit more, you could go for something like an XKRS, for instance, which is even rarer. But to me, this one, even just without those other options, is definitely worthy of your attention. On the market currently, at least at the time of releasing this video, in the UK in particular, and of course there's always going to be an advantage in the UK to buying a cheap Jaguar, you can pick up one of these from, say, a private seller, for instance, with relatively high mileage for about 10 grand. Now for an XKR, that's pretty amazing money. This one, for instance, is about 13,000 and it's in great condition. In fact, at the time of doing this review, APC have two of these for sale. One that's slightly newer, a little bit less mileage, and it's about a couple of grand more. But still, you're looking at like 13, 15 grand for this kind of car. That is a whole lot of car for the money. So now let's talk about how much car you get for the money. Now, of course, on that newer car, it's a 5-litre supercharged V8, 503 horsepower. This one is a 4.2-litre V8, still supercharged. In fact, it carries over a lot of that same heart and soul from the previous XKR, which of course finally had a 4.2 in those later of the earlier 2000s shape, the much more rounded XKs, which still gets a lot of love. This one though has about 20 horsepower more than that top of the range model had before it, 420 horses. Again, in comparison to the newer car, the 5 litre, it's about 80 or so horsepower less, which is a significant difference, but I'm going to talk about that difference more in just a second in terms of how it actually feels. The torque is good as well, not too surprisingly for a Jag V8, 413 pound-feet, and it definitely does a lot with that torque as well, because it is a large car. That's one of the things I love about it, in fact. However, speaking to that size and its dimensions in particular, including that crucial weight, I think one of the best things that Jaguar did with this generation overall, including even the 5 litre from later and certainly the base model from slightly earlier, is that they are far lighter than they easily could be. In fact, this car weighs 1,665 kilos. That is very, very good. It's a good 300 to 400 kilos lighter than something like, for example, the Mercedes SL600. That's a fantastic comparison, because that 300 kilo difference makes the world of difference through corners, and of course a lot of that is due to the copious use of aluminium, or aluminum for our American friends. Now that is the biggest advantage of this car over the previous XKR. It's lighter, stiffer, more focused in terms of cornering. Not that the previous car was bad, this one's just even better in that regard. In a straight line, it's still great, 4.9 seconds to 60, so of course not as quick as the 5 litre, that one's about 4.6 seconds, but let's be honest, you can't really feel that much of a difference. We're talking points of a second here, and also I did, as I mentioned earlier on, find this car more visceral than the 5 litre, so even though it's technically slower, I would argue this one almost feels faster. It makes a little bit more noise, it's a little bit more raucous, and I kind of like it for that. It's a little bit more playful and almost feels lighter as well. Lighter on its feet, that is, through corners, and very, very playful for sure. Now in terms of the top speed, of course it is limited to 155 anyway. Certain models can have it removed. I believe the XKRS even had a higher limiter, something like 175, so it's definitely got more potential. I do find it curious that the Speedo only reads up around 170, which is kind of unusual. A lot of cars tend to overestimate that. This one kind of goes lower end on the ballpark there. And in terms of now switching to the ergonomic side of things, the interior is interesting because I've heard some people criticize it for being a little bit too simple, sometimes even boring. I can understand that point of view, but for me, I actually really like the interior of these 2000s and even earlier 2010 Jags. They are simple. But sometimes that's kind of what you want. It has a simple, clean class, in my opinion, and it's not that the materials are subpar, it's high quality and things don't creak, which again, you know, if you buy an Italian equivalent, chances are it will. So it's not that it's a lack of quality, it's that sometimes people want a little bit more flair, and I understand that. Even the newer one, for instance, as you could see in my review of it, that 5 litre, it has a slightly restyled interior, but it's not that much different. The key difference that you'll notice is something which I loved in the XFR, and that is the gear selector. It's a simple thing, but it's just fun to use. It's this rise up twist knob to move it into position. However, in the case of this car, because of its age, it has the slightly more traditional clunk into place kind of shifter, and I will say, as much as I love that twist knob in the XFR, I actually prefer this method for an XK. Because in the newer XKR, it feels fine, but it just feels more, I don't know, appropriate almost for a sports car rather than a super saloon to have this chunkier gear selector that you manually clunk into place. It just feels like you're doing more. It's more fun to me. In the grand scheme of things, of course, it's not the most important thing in the world, but it's the smaller details and the way things feel, you know, the clunk of a door, the clunk of a button, the way the shifter feels or looks. That's the kind of stuff that you see on a daily basis when you're sitting in the car. So for me, it is kind of important. In terms of comfort and space, it's fantastic. In fact, one of the most impressive things about all of the Jags that I've reviewed, but especially the XKs and the XFR in particular, are they strike a fantastic, and I don't use that word lightly here, a fantastic balance between being very comfortable but not being too soft. You could easily have a car that ends up just feeling like a boat. You know, the classic American 50s and 60s cars are a perfect example, where they just float around all over the place. They're not exactly great through corners though. Then on the other hand, you have something like say a Maserati, which isn't uncomfortable. Mine, for instance, it had good handling and it was comfortable, but it wasn't as comfortable as these Jags. That to me is a difficult balance to strike, and they do it very well. In fact, this car does an excellent job of soaking up the bumps in the road, but at the same time you can feel the road. So you don't feel disconnected, but you don't have your teeth rattled out of your head. So as a comparison, for example, to something like a Porsche 911, say a 993 which I've reviewed, or the 997 more recently, I actually found those to be a little bit harsh on the suspension, and I said as much in those reviews. That's never an issue with these Jags. And a much more telling comparison to make is when you put this up against an Aston. Now, a while ago, of course, I reviewed the last generation 2014 Vantage Roadster, which was the end of that era for Aston Martin's design, and it was a gorgeous car, of course, but it wasn't that comfortable. No, it wasn't uncomfortable, but it had a little bit of a lack of feel to me. These Jags, as far as I'm concerned at least, are definitely superior to the way that that one felt. And they're also a lot cheaper. So in terms of bang for buck and value for money, well, they're a pretty great deal. Now, to go back to that interior just for a second before we get to stuff like fuel economy and day-to-day usability, the interior space is fantastic. You can see from a number of the camera angles, I'm not exactly wanting for space. In fact, I'm 6'3", but I can put the seat so far back that I can barely reach the pedals. That's how good the space is in this car. The major disadvantage of that is because, for example, this isn't a super saloon like an XFR with 4 doors and, full-size rear seats. If you are a larger driver or have a larger, taller passenger, the rear seats are going to be basically non-existent. That's the only drawback. If you're a more average-sized person, though, or even a small person, you'll have tons of space in the back for instance, if you have kids or friends or whatever. I could put the seat forward if necessary, so you could get a couple of people in the back, but that's the only downside to the interior design. But again, it's a 2+2 GT, so it's not designed to be the most practical thing around. Trunk space is good on the XK, it's got 300 litres. And in terms of that fuel economy, I know a lot of people won't care about that, but one of the reasons why I like to bring it up is because these Jags are actually very impressive for the kind of economy that they can do. Around town, it basically gives you what you'd expect, which is about 16.5 miles per gallon. However, you take it on the highway, that jumps up to 35. That's very good for a 4.2 litre supercharged V8 GT car that can do 0 to 60 half a second quicker than the previous XKR and a full second quicker than the base model. Even the average fuel economy between city and highway is still about 25. In other words, that's better than my Quattroporte was. That averaged more like 20 to 22 at best. So again, excellent comparison for a car which is faster than that Maserati in question. So in other words, with a 70 litre tank, which is 15.5 UK gallons, which of course is different to US gallons, you're looking at a range of a minimum of about 390 miles. And that's with the average of 25. So if you do exclusively motorway miles, you could get a whole lot more than that, well over 400 in fact. And again, for a GT, that's pretty good. Overall then, the reason why I consistently sing the praises of XKs, in fact even more so than the F-Type, is because to me the F-Type is a fantastic sports car. It really is. It looks great, sounds great, has excellent handling, lovely interior. I said all of that as much in my review. The difference is though, the XK for me just has those few extra boxes ticked, which make all the difference for me. The 2 extra seats in the back, more trunk space, more space in general inside, especially in terms of legroom and headroom. It's a larger car, physically speaking, so it's more imposing, but at the same time, it's not an offensively large car. Nobody's going to be, offended seeing one on the road. They look great. They're not quite as unicorn-ish as an Aston Martin, but they're definitely not far off in terms of how pretty they are. Personally, I actually like the look of these Jags more than their equivalent Astons. So across the board, for that kind of price, 10 to 15 grand, it's a lot of car for the money. So for my final verdict on this XKR, my opinion and where it falls on this vehicle is, if I were going to buy an XK, I would actually go for the base model. This same generation, but the 300 horsepower car. I like the look of that one more. It's smoother, cleaner, doesn't have the extra, intakes on the bonnet and all that. Not that this looks bad, I just like that smoother look. It's a little bit more useful day to day, and a little bit cheaper as well, around 7 to 8 grand compared to this one's 10 to 15. Either way though, it's so much car for the money and a fantastic car for the money as well. These engines are also incidentally known to keep going on forever. 160, 170,000 miles, even more if they're cared for well. And that alone should make you strongly consider this compared to, for example, something like my aforementioned Maserati, other equivalent, say Italian cars in particular, maybe a couple of French options or German ones. The fact that a Brit can still have that kind of reliability is nice, because that's not usually something which you bring up for a British car. In terms of comparing this one to the 5-litre, well, as I've kind of alluded to a number of times in this video, my heart is with this one. The 5-litre is faster, it is more valuable currently, but to me, I prefer the look of this one. It's a little bit louder, and it feels more fun. It's technically not as fast and not as powerful, but it's just that little bit cheaper, still gives you so much for the money, and to me that makes all the difference. It's at least as usable day to day. I prefer that clunk shifter over the gear knob selector, and to me all of those small details add up to make this, for me at least, the superior car at the moment. But tell me your thoughts down below if you are an XK owner of whichever particular generation. Doubtless I will feature more XKs in the future, maybe the slightly older one even, and until next time I'll see you then. So if you are new to the channel, be sure to hit the bell of course, so that you can see my new vids as soon as they come out. And if you haven't clicked any of the top right annotations that came up in the video, you can click here on screen to see all of my other reviews as well. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.